Awesome. Thanks, Asha, for the introduction. For those who don't know me, I'm an external PhD student and I'm located in regional New South Wales of Mudgee. So today I'll be presenting on the community attitudes on mine rehabilitation of open cut coal mines in regional New South Wales. And I just wish to acknowledge my supervisors as well as my co-authors on this research, which is Ben and Marit. So feel free if you've got any questions at any time to jump in. If not, obviously we've got allocated question times at the end. So it's widely accepted that community engagement on mine rehab and closure outcomes is needed to ensure this successful transition. Sorry, I'm just going to close that down. Successful transition, to these post-mining land uses. However, there appears to be very little research available on what the community actually thinks about mine rehabilitation. We're aware of one extensive study that was held down in the Latrobe Valley, which is the brown coal mines, which are all coming up for, well, there's one coming up for closure now. However, that report wasn't made public, and it was used for policy direction. And Ben has also undertaken, and Michael have undertaken some research too on the community preferences. So very little research that's been done on that. And adding to that, there's very few examples of mine sites in Australia that have actually successfully achieved their mine rehabilitation objectives, which also raises some important questions around the effectiveness of the current mine closure and rehabilitation process. As such, so our research is aiming to investigate these public attitudes on mine rehabilitation, and we're looking specifically at regional New South Wales. And we're only really looking at open cut coal mines as well. So we did this through some focus groups, and they were with members of the public as well as some mining stakeholders, and they were held in Mudgee and Dubbo. And then we've analysed the responses through the using thematic analysis, and that's pretty much what I'm presenting on today. And we've also used these outcomes to help us inform a choice model design that we're about to undertake, and that's designed to allow us to value some of the mine rehabilitation attributes. So therefore, we believe that this research is going to be useful to support decision and policy making, as well as improve mining companies' engagement processes around mine rehabilitation. Mining remains a significant contributor to the Australian economy, and really it's the backbone of many regional communities. So coal mining in the Hunter Valley, for example, alone employs 14,000 workers, and it directs over $4.3 billion into the local economy during 2018 and 19. But at the same time, mining often introduces these environmental impacts like the dust you can see here in this photo, and social impacts that are generally typically felt through the surrounding communities. So community awareness and concern for the environment has never been greater than it is right now as well. So as a consequence, mine rehabilitation is required to be ever more effective and have outcomes in keeping with the desires and aspirations of the community, and be acceptable to regulators and other stakeholders. So just so we're all on the same page, what is mine rehabilitation? So it's the practice of restoring mine land to a safe standard that's generally suitable for a post-mining land use. And when I talk about a post-mine land use, it's really what the rehabilitated area is going to be used for after it's been completed. And it typically, I know I simplify this process, but it typically includes reshaping of the waste rock dumps and placing some topsoil on top, and then stabilising that landform through using appropriate vegetation that's going to support, that's all driven towards that desired post-mine land use. And it's general practice that mining companies now undertake rehabilitation in this progressive manner once, you know, an area is no longer required for operational purposes. So now it's really seen that it's more integrated into that mine process rather than just something that happens at the end of mining. So mine rehabilitation is undertaken typically to not only minimise environmental impact, so it's classed as a risk mitigation tool. It's also compliance. It's also a compliance obligation, and it also demonstrates social performance of mining companies as well. And there's also this real current public expectation that mining rehabilitation will occur and that mines just aren't going to be abandoned. So it's really seen as an important aspect to the mining industry as well. So it's widely accepted that community engagement on mine rehabilitation and closure outcomes, it's needed to ensure this acceptance and successful transition to the post-mining land uses. And communities are often engaged about mine rehabilitation and closure aspects throughout the mine life cycle, and that occurs through various forums. So such engagement is not only a current regulatory requirement, but it's also now widely accepted and recognised as part of the corporate social responsibility of mining operators. And it's expected that, you know, if you live in a community, that you should also have a say in the decisions that affect the lives of that area, and that participation should also result in better planning outcomes as well. Yet according to some researchers like McAllister et al., often decisions are still being made on behalf of the communities. So currently negotiations between mining companies and the regulators ultimately determine the outcomes of the mine closure and rehabilitation. Community stakeholders typically have involvement through mining companies through their engagement programs, as well as the regulatory approval process. However, more and more community members are continually requesting more input into those decision-making processes. And it could be suggested that this is a response to communities perhaps believing that they're the ones who are going to be left, you know, with the consequences after the mine closes, that therefore they should have a bigger stake in that decision. And additionally, communities are frequently demanding more transparency. So best practice initiatives by mining companies involve full transparency of their proposed plans, so what they're going to do, and that all helps to establish trust with the community. And failure to engage stakeholders effectively is really believed to be a primary failure of the mine closure process. So it's really about engaging the community during the mine life and not leaving it at the end of the mine to say, hey, we're about to close the mine, how about you get on board in these discussions? So community involvement in decision making should also improve the quality of the decision. Although we recognise members of the community are clearly likely to hold diverse opinions and views about mine rehabilitation and even the mining industry in general. So when we talk about community, I think it's important that we recognise that there's different meanings of community as well. For example, typically most people will consider the community to be those who are immediately surrounded around the mine. But as we're seeing more recently, it's really becoming a network of people who are perhaps geographically dispersed, but are likely linked through a shared set of interests or experiences. So just these photos, these are all relevant to the mines around Mudgee, which I'll go into a little bit later. But so here, the stakeholder landscape is shifting. So the community have a larger voice than ever before, and you know, people are becoming more educated, they've got access to information, community is certainly getting more organised and strategic as well. So just these photos here, you can't really see, but we've got an establishment here on the east coast of Australia called Lock the Gate. I don't think that they're on your side of the country, but you know, that's an example of one such organisation where they have a huge following and they run very coordinated protest campaigns. And even in these pictures here, you can see that you know, community members aren't happy with the current regulatory stakeholder engagement process. So here they're protesting not only against the mines themselves, but here they're protesting actually against the process as well. So this is Mudgee. This here is actually in Sydney, so it goes way down the street. It was a big protest about a proposed new coal mine. And this is old mate Cole, who lives down close to one of the coal mines. You know, so certainly different aspects to community. And so just to lead to that, so in our research, we're defining community as any members of the general population of New South Wales. And we aim to understand these community members' perceptions towards mine rehabilitation. And we do acknowledge that their comments may be influenced if they've been affected by mining or perhaps their personal morals and ethics. So just a bit of scene setting. So this is where I'm presenting from today, Mudgee, and we are 270 kilometres over the sandstone curtain, as we refer to the Blue Mountains from Sydney. So this is the Midwest Regional Council area, and there's 24,000 people live in this area. There's 3 active coal mines, which are up here in Newland, and that's approximately 40 kilometres north of Mudgee. You can also see Dubbo over here to the west, and it's about 120 kilometres from Mudgee. And Dubbo is sort of the town that you go to. It's the next largest centre to Mudgee. So when you need something you can't get in Mudgee, you go to Dubbo. So as I said, there's 3 active coal mines in our area. They're both open cut and underground operations, and they're major employers for our area. Again, just a little bit more background on Mudgee and other land uses. Lots of agriculture in relation to cattle and sheep. We're not broadacre farming area. Tourism is a major component of our industry. So this is just a photo here of the annual the Food and Wine Festival. Lots of wineries. There's 40 odd cellar doors in our area, and we're surrounded by conservation areas and national parks. Dubbo, on the other hand, so it's a major service centre to Western New South Wales. There's about 55,000 people living in their local government area. Healthcare and social assistance is the largest employer in that region. Other industries include, you know, retail and education. Tourism is another big one. So they have the Dubbo Zoo, and that's a breeding program for the Taronga Zoo in Sydney. So tourism's a big thing. Agriculture is big also, and also is government as well. So because it services most of Western New South Wales from Dubbo, you know, every government department pretty much has an office in Dubbo. So it's important to note that there's no active mining in Dubbo area, and certainly no coal mines in the project phase either. So just moving on to focus groups. So for those who aren't familiar with focus groups, they sit within the qualitative research tradition. And at the simplest level, it's a group experience comprising of a small number of people who are recruited to discuss subject matter based on their shared experience. You know, it's typically a structured and open plan discussion, and it's facilitated by an experienced facilitator. Look, there's a heap of information out there about how to design and run a focus group, and so I won't go into that any further. But I just wanted to highlight that the benefits of using focus groups is that it can create, you know, and generate quickly a wide range of discussion and data, and it's very cost effective, and it allows this dynamic interactions between participants, and you know, that allows ideas to be formed. So for our research, we held 3 focus groups, and they again were held in Mudgee and Dubbo, and that was actually held in July 2019. We actually ran them in 2 different formats. So we held one in Dubbo and one in Mudgee using one format. So we had about 15 people, local community members, attend those sessions, and they were run over about an hour and a half. Whereas the other session, we referred to it as our technical expert workshop, and it was held in Mudgee. And that session included having representatives from who are probably more familiar with the local coal mines. And so we had 14 people come along from, you know, environmental groups, Chamber of Commerce, mine employees, the council, and other community members. And that session ran for about 3 hours. So that workshop was actually facilitated by Marit, and I was just an observer that day, just to remove any potential bias due to my relationship, because I know, you know, all of the participants in the room. The addition to that session is we had this breakout session, and that included, you know, so we broke the 14 people into 3 groups, and we made sure that those 3 groups weren't stacked. So we spread out the expertise between those 3 groups, and we gave each of them this map, and a large map, as you can see here in this photo, and said, look, you pretend that you are the decision makers. What would you like to see for this mine? So what land uses would you like to see? And so they present, so you probably can't see it very well, but they drew all over the map, and you know, they've collated what land uses, and we asked them to stipulate why you've chosen those land uses and what information you would need to make those decisions. And then each group presented back to the larger group, and then we continued on with our discussions. So now just moving into the analysis, don't worry too much about the detail here. It's just to demonstrate the themes that we've identified. And so essentially we've recorded all of the focus groups, obviously with their permission, and we transcribed the sessions, and then before we undertook our thematic analysis of the data. So essentially thematic analysis is a method for identifying, analysing and reporting patterns or themes within the data. So essentially a bucket of data, and you just keep breaking it down in a systematic way into smaller chunks of meaning. And that's again what I'll be presenting on today. So just moving straight into the results. So across all workshops, participants actively discussed their thoughts on mine rehabilitation. So when considering the definition of mine rehab, there really wasn't a consistent response from all participants. So some people preferred to focus on the ecological aspects, and, you know, detail that with using such language as replanting or regeneration, and it's about the vegetation types and how they functioned, while others suggested that this really shouldn't be the only focus, and other aspects should include the usefulness of the rehabilitation, or simply just not leaving a mess. Stakeholder engagement was also identified, with one participant particularly stating, you know, to them, rehab is an engaged stakeholder with input and an agreed output from the very start. So that's certainly a different take on mine rehabilitation. Quality of the rehab was discussed across all the groups, and broadly speaking, participants believe that the industry is performing well when it comes to rehab, with such comments as, you know, mining companies seem to be doing more lately, and that they've improved a lot, you know, really indicating that perhaps this is a more recent trend. However, the discussions in 2 of the focus groups did concentrate on the Hunter Valley in particular. So the Hunter Valley, large area, large concentration of open cut coal mines, and that's where these photos come from, and very much about communities. You drive down the highway, you've got mines on either side, and you're just looking at these massive walls of waste rock dump material. And you know, so there were comments from some of the groups to say you know, that these areas look like a moonscape, and that the mines in these areas need to be shut down, as it really looks like a bomb has gone off. So while all participants agree that rehabilitation is important to complete, one focus group solely believe that it's really the regulators that are forcing rehabilitation to happen. And it suggested that it's due more to these recent, so there's been a bit of a change in the regulatory focus here in New South Wales, and so the rules and regulations are now far more stringent, and it's not really because mining companies are wanting to do the right thing. So when we explored, you know, how we can improve these visual impacts of mining, and we suggested perhaps maybe the community might be willing to sacrifice community funding that's generally provided by the mining companies if it meant that a mine had time to spend more on mine rehabilitation. And the participants basically stipulated that they're not willing to accept a lesser quality standard, with one participant really insisting that the community are not willing to allow a cheaper ecosystem, even if it means less money is available for these programs. You know, so perhaps indicating not only is rehab really important, but it's also undertaken you know, completed at a suitable standard, even if that means sacrificing community funding. Skepticism was expressed quite commonly among the participants of even a mining company's ability to achieve rehabilitation goals. However, this really predominantly seemed to be centred around the company's ability to reinstate the previous native ecosystems, and not really when discussing alternative land uses. Such comments included that mining companies, you know, can't put it back the way it was, or you'll never get the same ecosystem, which was a little bit surprising because we've actually undertaken some previous research to understand what the post-mining land use trends, you know, so what the mines in New South Wales are even trying to achieve. And it shows that 97% of all coal mines in New South Wales have actually nominated to put back these native ecosystems. So, you know, it just goes to show that the community is saying that's never going to happen, yet the mining industry is basically saying, well, we're, you know, 97% of sites are actually trying to achieve this. There was also this tone of distrust towards mining companies, as participants felt that there's a real lack of transparency on the actual plan. You know, so what are they trying to achieve, and to what standard, and even what is the end land use? So there is an expectation by community participants that, you know, mine operators really need to be more open and transparent, and that they felt transparency is key to make community engagement successful on rehabilitation matters. So community members are, you know, basically saying they don't even know what the local mines here are even trying to achieve. Communication, which clearly is linked to transparency, was identified as being something that's perhaps lacking as well, and some negative sentiments around that. For example, they're not even aware, especially when there's a change to a mining program, or even how they undertake rehabilitation, they feel like the mining companies aren't communicating that with them. And even just simple things like how much rehabilitation is actually being completed each year, they don't even know. So communities also felt that mining companies had an obligation to educate them on relevant rehabilitation and closure matters, because it can be quite complex, and they certainly feel that like they're not given that at the moment. Yeah, they feel like that's something that can be worked on. The process of completing rehab was raised across the three focus groups. It's generally agreed that rehab does take a long time, However, as long as it commences as soon as possible, this will be largely acceptable. There were contrasting views, however, on who should actually be responsible for rehab once finalised, with some suggesting that some mines should be responsible for care and maintain the land in perpetuity. So the mining company should be responsible forever, while as others acknowledge that new owners will obviously be responsible. Concerns around the aspects of risk were raised, again, by all three groups. This includes how rehab's actually currently being undertaken. Additionally, participants raised concerns on the risk associated with the rehab performance over time. So this includes potential climate change impacts and what might happen if failures occur in 50 to 100 years, with participants really wanting to know, well, who's going to be responsible for fixing it, meaning that there's this level of uncertainty around responsibility and how that may affect future generations. So this photo here, for example, is actually from a mine that I used to work up in Queensland. And, there is this real risk. This rehabilitation was performing well. And then we came in after a weekend and we found elements like this, and actually we found whole sections of rehabilitation had actually been burnt out. And this is what's known as spontaneous combustion. So hot coal was buried, it remained on fire, and then the vegetation's caught on fire. So, this is many years down the track after we'd completed rehabilitation. It hadn't been signed off, obviously, but there are real concerns there. The other thing too, there's also this concern raised around what the community and the government and mining companies don't know, or more broadly, the unknown risk of rehabilitation. This comment here really resonated with me. So, they didn't know about aluminium cladding on buildings. That too was government approved. So what about mine rehabilitation? So, it just goes to show you don't know what you don't know, and you certainly trust your government to act on your behalf and make these informed choices and decisions. So, I thought it was interesting that they were bringing that comment back to mine rehabilitation. Another focal point was around what they deemed successful rehabilitation to be and what are the benefits to society. So all groups identified that aesthetics, or what a mine looks like, is the most important to them when defining successful rehabilitation. And this specifically include how it looks, that it has to look good and it has to be attractive to look at. However, when this concept was further explored, the groups noted that this is not something that's easily to quantify, with one participant suggesting that the perception of what people believe is attractive and successful will be different, and which obviously will be influenced by where you live. The benefits of aesthetics were seen to reduce the visual impact of mining on a community, and it's obviously seen to help the mine lessen these impacts on the community, so thinking back to those Hunter Valley examples. That with such comments as, not looking like a moonscape, and it helps the community to even forget that there used to be a mine, with the suggestion that, in 200 years' time, we won't even know that there was a mine there. We've also discussed that the location of the mine, however, may influence visual requirements. For example, mines close to a town where people drive past every day may have that different level of visual appeal, whereas a mine further away from a community might not require the same level of visual relief. So we moved on to the physical characteristics of successful rehabilitation, and they were predominantly only really raised in two of the focus groups, where water, flora and fauna, and soil were identified. So discussion on water included both surface and groundwater, And it was especially topical in the Dubbo focus group, where we had some self-identified farmers who were in attendance. You know, and they covered such comments as, you know, no damage to groundwater and not having lost any groundwater systems are all indicators of success. Whereas the other group focused on predominantly surface water, where they felt, you know, just restoration of waterways resulting in clean water was particularly important. I think it's also really important to note when these discussions occurred, this area was under intense drought, and so the topic of water came up in everyone's conversation, so it's no surprise that it made it into these focus groups discussions either. So what I found interesting though was only one group identified having no mining voids left at closure was deemed successful rehabilitation and closure to them. Which I found interesting, since it's really a point of contention in any coal mining approval. You know, community members don't want to see mining voids left. And as consistent with the current regulatory obligations, making rehabilitated land safe for access, whether that's for people or wildlife or livestock, that was identified in two of the groups as a way to demonstrate success as well. One focus group touched on the health and well-being, and that successful rehabilitation is seen to alleviate impacts of the health and well-being, and that includes cultural perspectives, and you know, that restores the health of the community, you know, by removing that pollution as well. So this photo here I just wanted to highlight. So this is a picture from Yulin mine, which is one of the coal mines in the Mudgee area. And so this is what successful rehabilitation looks like in this instance. So, you know, their post-mining land use was around biodiversity values. So this section of rehabilitation has just been signed off by the regulators, so that's only this year. And it really is only a handful of mines in New South Wales who have actually received that certification. So that's good news. The ultimate goal identified across all the focus groups really is seeing rehabilitation evolve into a beneficial land use where the rehabilitation can be used or it's able to be passed on to the next landholder. Participants identified various aspects of creating this beneficial land use, and whether that means that it's beneficial to locals through employment, as well as creating an opportunity where there's income that could be raised to manage the land over time as well. So that was a bit interesting. And it's not just about people. So comments were also captured around, you know, having wildlife return to the areas is really just as important, and that's seen as a beneficial land use. It was agreed by those in one group in particular that the most favourable outcome was really to ensure that there's not an economic burden to the community at mine closure. So when even touching on employment, you know, participants were eager to point out that's not just about the land use after mining, but it's also about the process of undertaking the rehabilitation. And, you know, it's not just about the dozer operators and the truck drivers, but it also creates opportunities for other people in the industry around specialists like ecologists, other contractors and employees and things like that. So it's about attracting them to the area, and as well as their families, you know, which will hopefully supplement the loss of mine employees when a mine ceases to be productive. Furthermore, the aspect of sustainability of the post-mining land use was also really seen as a success indicator, in that the rehab is something that can be passed on to a future generation, but it's also an opportunity to limit further impacts on the environment by using the rehabilitated area, which is already classed as disturbed land, rather than going to disturb land elsewhere. Others suggested that having post-mining land use that's centred on alternative energy such as solar or wind farms could also be seen as a sustainable outcome for society. So this picture here is actually from Canada. I couldn't actually find any mines. I'm not aware of any mines in Australia where they've actually put solar as a post-mining land use. So moving on to the information for community members, what information do they need in decision making? Important aspects to attendees that would help them in that process were really broad and varied. Those identified as equally important were stakeholder demands, so what the community wanted, the physical attributes of the area, so the climate and the soil, for example, the land use proposed and who's going to own it were the most identified, whereas others had other considerations, included the regulatory requirements and sustainability matters and the economics. It was common for participants to view the post-mining land use decision as involving trade-offs between these different aspects, and ultimately, as long as the perceived benefits outweigh the costs of the rehab, generally that influenced their standpoint. The significance of appropriate stakeholders and engagement was identified across all the workshops as one of the most important aspects in that decision, the post-mining land use decision, and that included that community really should have the strongest say in what happens after a mine closes. Some participants, however, really felt like this is not what currently happens, as you saw in the earlier photos there with the protesting. And with the community having to inherit the post-mining land use rather than actually be part of the process, that really suggests an existing ineffectual process. It's worth pointing out here in New South Wales, which I believe is different to Western Australia. So the mine land, so it's typical to have a mine, and then there's usually a large buffer of land around a mine that's all typically owned by a mining company, and that's all privately owned. So it's really interesting that the community is saying that that they want to have a say, or that they even have a right into this process, even they don't own the land as well. So across all the groups, attendees identified land use and land ownership as important aspects. In particular, it was thought that the land use before mining, as well as what's around the mines, as being very relevant. It was said that the process should incorporate, though, a bit of a common sense approach. So if the pre-mining land use was pretty crap, well, clearly we don't want to see a crap land use reinstated, and that, some alternative land use should be identified. Surrounding land uses, on the other hand, the community felt like they should be one of the main driving forces behind what the mine should be turned into. So, if you're surrounded by a national park, well, to them it made sense that really if the mine has the ability to enhance a national park, then perhaps that's the more preferred beneficial land use. And when located near other mines, understanding what the collective mines are doing is crucial, as there was an expectation by participants that a mine's post-mining land use really shouldn't be looked at in isolation, and in turn could create further opportunities than just that singular mine. So this aspect of land ownership after a mine is rehabilitation was again common across all the groups. And they really felt it was important to identify who that future landowner was going to be, as it would help ease some of the uncertainty as to whether it's likely to be leased or sold once rehabilitation is established. And it also, they felt like if that person was identified at the beginning of the mine operation, perhaps that could influence the post-mining land use decision. Location and distance from the community were also key considerations, and it was suggested that larger populations close to a mine will obviously be in a better position to support various land uses, whereas more remote mines are likely to return to farming or biodiversity. So I put this photo in here. Again, this is another example here in New South Wales. So this is an old coal prep plant. So it's not a mine per se, but the coal is transported to the prep plant, and that's where it's processed for sizing, etc. And so this here is another one that's just been signed off this year in New South Wales. And this area here is actually being signed off, and it's going to be returned or created into residential, which is not common at all. So I just wanted to flag that one too. It's a beneficial land use. When discussing the economics of the post-mining land use decision, it was agreed that potential costs of the post-mining land use is really crucial to analyse and understand. One group suggested that the proposed land use has to be cost effective, as there is no use spending obviously a large amount of money if no one's going to come and use it. Equally, you don't want rehabilitation that has the potential to cost this large maintenance costs, as this could introduce residual risks and has the potential then to affect the community later. So that's why I've chucked this photo here. And so this is the Eden project in Cornwall, and it's probably the most well recognised successful transition of mining into a new post-mining land use. And so the Eden project, so it's all around tourism and education and sustainability. So again, it's no use building something like this in the middle of nowhere if no one's going to come and attend it. So it was generally agreed across all the groups that the costs of undertaking rehab should also solely be the responsibility of the mining company. So there's no real surprise there. There was an expectation by all that mining companies will use and do use some sort of analysis when considering their post-mining land uses. And it really was believed that the outcomes of this analysis will result in what is scientifically achievable for the site, but it's also going to be optimal for the local community. It was acknowledged that every mine should be analysed on its merits, and that it really can't be this broad brush, you know, one size fits all approach. And so that's even more reason to complete this evidence-based analysis. So when exploring the who in the decision making, so I was interested in Dubbo. They flagged it in particular that there should be this advisory group that's created, and that should consist of local representatives, you know, people like the mayor from the local government, or members of parliament, federal and state, and, you know, other government agencies and Chamber of Commerce people and community members. And ultimately they decide on behalf of the community. Although, and conversely, in another focus group, it was suggested that the government's kicked out of the decision altogether, and it really should just be left up to the community. So it was also raised that there should be this much stronger focus at the very start of the approval process, with significant community consultation, really about what the post-mining land use should be. And it was agreed that this is not currently occurring. There were contradictory discussions between participants when discussing whether the post-mining land use should even change over time or be flexible, and that might be due to technology advances, or, you know, touching back with the community to see what the expectations are. So some people agreed, yep, that's the more preferred approach, whereas others were like, no, it's locked in stone. Once it's approved, it should never be allowed to change. So some contradictory insights there. So this is nearly the last slide. So this is moving on to possible post-mining land uses for rehabilitation, and it was the ultimate discussion point across all the groups. So, you know, there are many different land uses that were identified. However, more specifically, they were identified in that expert working group, and these ones here are actually the ones, I haven't captured all of the post-mining land uses from the focus groups. These are just the ones that were presented in that expert working group. And so again, these have been nominated based on the participants' knowledge of the local mine and the surrounding areas and their expertise. So you can see that there's multiple land uses that have been identified, and they range right across the board. And pretty much that's the beauty of land uses. Obviously, your imagination is potentially what you just need someone who might want to do it, or you know, the mining companies typically don't do most of these. So I've put this wonderful, colourful picture in here because this is an example, perhaps. So someone in the focus group have identified an adventure park. This year is an adventure park. It's actually in Wales. It's an old slate mine, and they've converted it to an extreme trampoline centre. So, you know, these are possible land uses, and here's an example of it actually occurring out there, and perhaps not one for me. I hate heights. So I couldn't think of anything worse, but, you know, this is actually what's occurred out there. So the other interesting point here is you can see how many different land uses the community have actually identified for this particular mine. Well, this particular mine actually has only one post-mining land use that has been approved by the government, and that is conservation. So you can see this real difference between community expectations and perhaps what's actually, you know, what's actually happening. And just finally, you know, this preference to reinstate the pre-mining land use was discussed across all the groups. And in most of the conversations, it started off by saying, yep, pre-mining land use, that's what should be reinstated. But as the conversations really progressed, it became more obvious that people preferred the beneficial land use, and especially the ones that bring more jobs to a community. So it's quite common, this comment, I've just captured this comment, but it's pretty much the sentiments along most of the groups is, you know, what was there before is the best option, let's return it to that. But if there's a better option out there, well, you know, where communities and government can think of, well, that should really be looked at, and that's certainly what was the preferred approach. So just finally, in the discussions we explored, you know, community members' understanding of rehab, possible land uses after a mine closes, as well as what information is important to community members to assist them in making such decisions about what the suitable post-mining land uses may be. As I mentioned, the research is ongoing. This work all has assisted us with the choice model survey, and that hopefully will go out very shortly. So that'll value add to this research, and you know, hopefully we can be in a position to release that sooner rather than later. But I really wanted to also, I hope I've painted a picture around the complexities of community expectations when it comes to mine rehab. And really, if I put my mining hat on, because as you know, I'm from the mining industry, I felt as someone from the industry that I understood what the community views on mine rehabilitation would be. But it's not really until you go and ask them that you understand perhaps, you know, our expectations don't align. And, you know, I've worked in the industry, I don't know, 13, 14 years now, and I've never, in my capacity of working on a mine, specifically went and had a discussion, you know, with community members where their input has influenced a decision. It really is a, hey, we're from the mining industry, this is what we're going to do. And, you know, community members pretty much have to absorb those desires. So, you know, it's been a really good opportunity for me to undertake this research, and I really feel it's genuine, from genuine comments from the mining industry that they don't reflect the current regulatory processes at the moment, and therefore this work will hopefully highlight some opportunities for those in policy development as well as ongoing mining engagement strategies. And that's it. So if anyone's got any questions.
Thank you very much, Karin. If you have questions, you can raise your hand, or you can talk because you can unmute yourself.
Sorry, that was a lot to take in.
No, it was very interesting to understand what community says. And
yeah, it's a little bit different, isn't it? A little bit different from perhaps what this school looks at. You know, like I said before, it's the qualitative research aspects. Made me feel uncomfortable too. No comments, no questions. All right. Well, I'm always, you know, I'm in the.
So until people ask questions, what do you think about the future? Like, you know, your inputs will be taken to the regulatory process, and then there will be a change. Is that what you're looking for?
Well, this research will be presented at a mining industry conference. It should have already occurred, but COVID, there's a Life of Mine conference that's held every 2 years. It's quite a large industry conference. So, you know, this will be presented there. So, like I said, this research is being used also in the choice model as well. So, you know, that's going to, we're trying to change the discussion around mine rehabilitation, so, and what it actually brings to society. And, you know, so you need to go out there and ask these type of questions, and ask these perceptions, you know, and we will present them.
Okay, yeah. Dave has a question.
Hi, Karin, that was really interesting. What do you think the expectations of the regulator, the regulatory agencies are in relation to consultation? Like you've sort of said that the mining companies don't generally consult adequately.
It's sort of a chicken before the egg discussion most of the time when it comes to community consultation. There is certainly a focus, like I touched on it before, around regulatory reform. So most of the states in Australia have all recently gone through this regulatory reform process, where stakeholder engagement has certainly, and this evidence-based decision-making have all played a role in these regulatory reforms. So, like I said, I'm interested. I've never seen any mines out there where, you know, they're saying, hey, we're proposing to put biodiversity as our post-mining land use, and the community's saying, no, we don't want that. We want to see a ski park, for example. I have never seen where what the community want has influenced the decision. So I'm interested to see how the regulators are really going to back up. You know, they all recognise that as it's an important aspect when it comes to these decisions. So, yeah, I'm interested to understand how that's actually going to play out. But when there's such a large number of mines who are all going to close very soon as well, so that's again why these discussions are so important to have, because you want the transition from mining to another land use to happen as easily and as quickly as possible. And there's, you know, there's government inquiries happening it seems like every second day lately about how that's actually going to happen. Yeah.
Do you have thoughts on how different it would be in WA? You know, where our mines are generally not located in areas with such a high population density as in New South Wales?
So I touched on land ownership as well. So here in New South Wales, you know, they're predominantly owned by private entities. Obviously over there, I think that's owned by the government.
It's Crown land largely.
Yeah,
not solely, but often.
I think that will play a part as well, because, and we're also doing other research as well to understand, well, how does that happen? So if your mines are out in the middle of nowhere, you know, surely you shouldn't expect them to develop into these, you know, other beneficial land uses. You just want to create a safe and stable landscape, you know. Yeah, I'm not 100% over Western Australia, I'm solely, the coal mines are really my background here in Queensland and New South Wales as well. But there's certainly this pressure. So they're looking at it now from, I touched on Latrobe Valley, for example. They are really leading the way, and they're looking at it more of a regional landscape perspective when it comes to mine closures. So they're trying to understand how the mines can make the regional land uses more appealing, and you know, it's going to be sustainable for their communities and things like that. So who's responsible ultimately? Is it a mining company to understand what the community requirements are going to be in 20 or 40 years time, or is it really, should it be the government who leads the way? So I know over in the Western Australia, in the Pilbara, they've got this Pilbara Regional Development Group, and that's exactly what they're doing. So they're looking at similar to the Latrobe Valley, where they're looking at the larger area and the land uses and how, you know, community requirements and things like that into the future. But yeah, I don't think that's not an industry-led thing. That's more of a business. I don't even think that they're government. I
think they're sort of semi-government.
Oh, yeah, well, there you go. Yeah. So.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, Michael.
So I'm sorry, I had to take a phone call just at the end. So you may have explained this, and I missed the critical bit. So this, you do have a choice modelling component that's going to map this. So what's the sample, the population you're going to be surveying of that? Is it just local communities, or is it going to be the more general population? We're
doing two populations, so the general New South Wales population, and then we're doing specifically the Midwest Regional Council area, just to understand those local dynamics versus the general state population.
So you're going to be able to look at with that local one to see how those mapped onto what was coming out of your qualitative stuff, to see if those resonate as well?
Perhaps. I think more data is better than not. And obviously, even it's going to be hard to find really populations in New South Wales who aren't affected by mining. It's just such a major industry here, and so many people are employed or know people in the industry, etc. So even getting people from the population and the general, from the general population, you're probably still going to find that they have that mining. They've been impacted by mining and may influence their results. So, yeah.
Okay. That'd be interesting to see.
I'm looking forward to getting the model out there. Because there's other questions too that sit outside of the choices as well. So we're looking to understand people's preferences, or trust and other elements there as well. So it's not just about the choices in our survey. There's other elements too that are going to value add to this discussion as well. Yeah. All right.
Okay.
Well, again, if you've got any questions, by all means, I'm on the email list, and hopefully one day I'll make it across the borders.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Everyone again. One day.
Okay, thank you very much, Karin, for agreeing to present your progress. And though it is qualitative, it's very interesting. We can see the insights from the community, and I think you're doing well. So you're going to do the choice experiment next. So next week, we are going to have a seminar on using well-being to assess future scenarios, a multi-stakeholder approach by Dr. Milanakian. So please join me thanking Karin, and also see you next week.